Believe it or not, now's a good time to sow tomato seed. Now, it may seem a month early to you, but with a few tips we're going to give you, you can get into the garden with your tomatoes a month early and be eating tomatoes before Memorial Day, guaranteed. Now, here's a good way to start. These are some tomato seed that I've pre-germinated. I've soaked them in water for 48 hours, and it's just in shallow water that I've shaken around several times to make sure they get oxygen. And as you can see, the tomato seed have already sent out little roots. They've already gotten started. And the next step is to have your soil all prepared. I have some plastic 4-packs here that I've filled with a potting mix that is for seedlings. It's a very fine texture. And just carefully drop these down in to the 4-packs. I'm going to put 2 in each one just to make sure, in case they get damaged in transplanting, that I'll get a stand of them. Now, if you haven't pre-germinated, you can still go ahead and sow them in the pots just plain, and they'll do just fine. They'll be up in about 5 days. Now, when you're sowing tomato seed, make sure that you use clean pots and sterile potting mix. It's important that you keep them in a warm place. They like a soil temperature of around 70 degrees in order for the seed to germinate and grow very quickly. And that brings me to another point on sowing tomato seed. Tomato roots do not like to be crowded the least little bit. And so once you get them growing up in a pot, make sure that once they have several true leaves that you keep an eye on that root system. And if you look along the sides, if it starts to get pot bound the least little bit over the next 6 to 8 weeks, shift it up to the next largest size. In fact, you may want to shift it 2 or 3 times before planting it. I know some backyard tomato growers that will end up with a single tomato plant in a 12-inch pot before setting it outside. Now, in Oklahoma Gardening, we've shown several ways for supporting tomato plants. And think about this before you select your varieties. Remember that determinate tomato plants are the ones that stay fairly short and bear most of their crop all at one time, and so they will not need much in the way of staking. You could probably use a cage around them and get away with it just fine. Indeterminate tomato plants are the ones that will bear a long season. They're the ones that if you plant now and pick tomatoes all season long, you can expect to still be harvesting some at Thanksgiving with some frost protection. Now with those, they're going to need to have some kind of support, either a cage or our cattle panel fences like we showed last year, or the stake and weave method, or just simply be tied to a stake or trained onto a fence of some sort. With that, make sure that you plan on pruning them through the summer and keeping them watered and fed. Well, I have this tomato seed sown. I'm going to water it in with a fine mist, cover it with plastic. As soon as I see any shoots coming up, I'm going to put them under fluorescent lights. And remember, a fluorescent light fixture with both a cool white and a warm white will give you the perfect balance of light for raising transplants. Keep that just barely over the top of the leaves and raise it as they grow. Keep them fed with liquid fertilizer at every other watering, and within 6 to 7 weeks you should be able to set them outdoors. Now let's go out to the garden, and I'll give you some tips on getting your soil ready for setting those tomato transplants by the middle of March and give you a head start in your garden. Believe it or not, even though it's early February, the soil for tomatoes needs to be prepared now. And what I've done in our raised bed garden is first go through here and turn over the soil with a shovel. I've smoothed it off with a garden rake, and now I've marked my planting holes for tomatoes with some ground agricultural lime. The reason for adding lime to a tomato planting hole is if you've ever had blossom end rot or rotting on the very bottom side or blossom side of a tomato fruit, you may not know this, but that's due to a deficiency of calcium. It's also due to uneven watering. But to help ensure that we may not get blossom end rot, I want to add a source of calcium ahead of time, and lime is a good source of that. So I've marked my planting holes with a little bit of agricultural lime, about 1/4 to 1/2 cup, and I'll be working that in with some compost. Tomatoes love a lot of organic matter. So I'm going to work in some compost to each hole. Just dump it along here, and these are spaced 2 to 3 feet apart. You want to give tomatoes plenty of room to grow. We mentioned in raising seedlings that you never want them to get crowded. Well, tomatoes also won't perform well in the garden if they're allowed to be crowded. Also make sure that the site you select for planting the tomatoes is in full sun. You'd be surprised how many people try to grow tomatoes in a semi-shady area and don't have much success. Remember that that's a fruiting plant and it needs a lot of sun in order to produce well. Well, I'm going to work in this compost and lime, work them in real well together, and make sure that it's distributed nicely right around the planting hole. And then the next step will be to warm up the soil. Now, in planting tomatoes, we normally put them out in mid-April, but if you want a month's jump on planting to put them out in mid-March, you're going to have to make sure that that soil is as warm as possible. The first step in doing that is having your planting holes prepared well ahead of time, because it may be rainy weather when you get to planting time, and also having the soil loosened up really well and making sure that it's moist. And that way, when we stretch some plastic over this planting site, it will be able to transfer heat energy down into the soil. With a loosened, moist soil, it'll transfer heat better than an unprepared site. And you've got a lot of your work done ahead of time when it comes time to plant the tomatoes. If you've had a soil test and you need to add potassium or phosphorus, make sure you work those in before planting as well, because they won't wash down into the soil like nitrogen. You can add nitrogen any time of year because it's water soluble and it'll rinse right on down in. Okay, those are prepared pretty well. Well, the next step is to try to warm the soil up. Now, this step needs to be done anywhere from 2 weeks to a month before planting. I'm going to stretch out some clear plastic here and get that secured first. Well, from the looks of the condensation collecting under the clear plastic, I think we have plenty of moisture in our soil to help transfer heat down into the soil to pre-warm it for planting tomatoes. Now, why don't want to use clear plastic on a vegetable garden? A lot of you who have problems with Bermuda grass may think that's just crazy because it will get the weeds to growing early on before you plant your tomatoes. The reason for using clear plastic is that it will warm the soil up faster and up to 10 degrees higher than black plastic will. However, if you do have a weed problem in your garden, use the black plastic. It's certainly better than using nothing, and it will still adequately warm the soil for tomato planting. Now, the plastic, again, needs to go down 2 to 4 weeks before planting the tomatoes, and then use a soil thermometer and make sure that soil temperature is around 70 degrees, which is ideal for tomato roots. The next step is to make some kind of provision for getting the tomatoes to have nice warm growing conditions once you set them out in the garden. And there are a lot of things you can do for frost protection, placing a milk carton over the top or using a wax paper hot cap or making a little cloche out of plastic. But there's only one item that will protect from freezes, and that's what's called a wall of water. And I want to show you how that works. The wall of water is a clear plastic cylinder, makes about an 18-inch diameter teepee around the tomato plant. And it has separate chambers that hold water. What we do is after our soil is warmed and we're ready to plant, you plant your tomato and then you set up your wall of water around it. Now I'm putting down some 2-foot long pieces of reinforcing bar. You can also use wooden stakes, and this will help you to fill it more easily, and it might help if we have some really windy weather. For instance, if you live in Caddo County where the wind doesn't stop blowing, this may be what you have to do to protect the plants. As you've probably guessed by now, one of these takes a heck of a long time to fill, but it's worth it. The idea of surrounding a tomato plant with a teepee of water-filled tubes is that it's protected from freezing because on a very cold night, that water has retained heat in it from the day's sunshine, and water releases heat much more slowly than just plain air. And so inside where the tomato plant is, it will receive a nice, slow release of heat from the wall of water during the night. And so it can be protected down to 20 degrees or maybe even a little bit lower. So for that reason alone, this is a great vehicle for getting early tomatoes in your garden here in Oklahoma. Now I've removed the reinforcing bar stakes so that it can collapse in on the top. And that's part of how it protects the plant. If you left the stakes in place at night and it had a very open hole, too much heat would escape. In fact, on a very, very cold night, you might even want to lay a piece of fabric or plastic over the top to hold in as much heat as possible. But this is one way to get tomatoes in the garden early. Now just to repeat the steps real quickly on very early tomatoes is get your seeds sown now, pre-germinated if possible. Keep the plants growing as fast as possible. Don't let those transplants get crowded. Harden them off ahead of time. 2 to 4 weeks before planting, get your soil ready, get the plastic on it, and get it heating up. And then when you set the tomato plants out, whether you plant directly into the plastic or into soil, put a wall of water around them so that they'll heat up. Now the reason we're showing you this now is so you have time to order these from a mail order catalog or ask your garden center to order some for you. The price for wall of waters runs around $8 for 3 of them. So they're not cheap, but it's a great way to get an early start on your tomato crop.
We hope you've enjoyed this classic from the Oklahoma Gardening Vault. Remember, even though these tips and techniques are timeless, there's always something new to learn in the world of gardening. By subscribing to both Oklahoma Gardening and OK Gardening Classics, you'll have access to a wealth of gardening knowledge, both classic and contemporary.